All right. Well, welcome to Men, Masculinity, and Racism during social unrest and COVID. Where do we go from here? Thank you all for being with us. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website so you can revisit it in the future as well as share it with others. My name is Tom Schiff. I am the co-founder and executive director of Fallacies. I want to briefly introduce you to Fallacies, then introduce our panelists and begin our dialogue. I also want to acknowledge Fallacies co-founder, Dr. Taj Smith, who is the Director of Diversity Education at Rochester Institute of Technology and is our tech guy behind the scenes tonight. I want to acknowledge Taj for the work he has done in organizing this event and helping to make Fallacies what it is, and for all of the great work that he does in the world. It is an honor to call you a friend and a colleague, Taj. Fallacies is a nonprofit based in Western Massachusetts. We are a men's health dialogue and theater program. Our primary focus is secondary and post-secondary education, but we also work with a variety of non- and for-profit organizations. We provide dialogue, performance, and a variety of consulting services. Currently, we are working to move the performance aspect of our work online, and we have a group of male-identified folks who are doing so. We meet on Monday evenings. This current group, the members are incredible, and we're looking to expand this and opening this group up for new participants in January. So if you're interested and you want more information, you want to join, please be in touch with me. Fallacies is part of a larger movement of folks seeking to make the world safer, healthier, and just. We are deeply indebted and inspired by the past and current feminist, civil rights, queer rights, and all human rights movements who have and continue to pave the way with their courage, their vision, and their leadership. So first and foremost, Fallacies about dialogue. So tonight, we are here to have a dialogue about the connection of men, masculinity, race, racism, as it relates to COVID and the unrest about social injustice, with particular focus on the United States. We are honored to have these four men who are with us here to be part of this dialogue. They are brilliant thinkers and activists in their own rights. Their full bios are on our website in the description of this event, but I want to also introduce each of them right now and give you some, just to give you some information about each of them. So I'm going to start with Benny Williams. So Benny D. Williams serves as the Assistant Dean of Students, and he's the Director of the Multicultural Student Center at Canisius College in Buffalo, New York. In these roles, Benny Williams is charged with supporting and advancing the college's initiatives related to student experience and the focus on students of color and the education of the entire student population around issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Welcome, Benny. Dr. Benjamin Neal, he's a licensed clinical psychologist in Colorado and owns a private practice, Grandview Therapy and Consulting, LLC, based in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Dr. Neal has a specialized treatment focus on trauma, anxiety, and mood disorders with emerging adults, veterans, and older adults. His inclusive practice provides a therapeutic space to provide how one's intersecting identity group memberships, including race, gender, sexuality, give cultural context for their specific disorder presentation. Dr. Darrell Brooks is an interdisciplinary research scholar practitioner and a social justice educator from Baltimore, Maryland. He's the founder and CEO of Love and Justice Consulting, LLC, an organization that provides leaders with diversity and social justice learning opportunities to increase their capacity to effectively and authentically engage difference. He's also a research associate at the Bloomberg School of Public Health, where his current research explores examining the historical and contemporary implications of medical mistrust and its impact on COVID-19 racial disparities among African Americans. And if that wasn't enough, he's also a W.K. Kellogg Foundation Community Leadership Network Fellow and supports racial justice and healing for all children and families. And as I said to you earlier, Darrell, it's really great to see you again, Dr. Brooks. Noah Prince is a speaker, facilitator, and consultant to business and organizational leaders. His focus is on culture, leadership development, and enhancing leadership effectiveness through relationship and employee equity. His down-to-earth, people-centered, and engaging style continues to have a huge impact on every audience with whom he works. And as a colleague of Noah's, I can 100% attest to this. Noah specializes in working with Fortune 500 companies, tech startups, education groups, nonprofits, and individual clients. His interest in diversity and inclusion in this work developed from a combination of parental influence and diverse social experiences that introduced him early on to the power of humanity. Now, if you have questions for our panelists as we go along, please feel free to put them in the chat to Taj Smith, and we'll try to get to at least some of these before the end of our time together. So please use the Q&A function, and let's get going here. So what I'm going to ask each of you to do, each of our panelists, I would love for each of you to share for roughly 1 to 2 minutes about what brings you to this conversation about intersections of masculinity and race and racism. And I realize that men is not a monolithic term or identity. And with that said, what have been some of your observations about how men have responded to our current times dealing with COVID, the presidential election process? Just want to pause right there for a second. Black Lives Matter, and other current social processes. So let's see. Benny, I'd like to ask you to start if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, Tom, thank you. So I think one of the things that brings me to this conversation is how I was born and raised. And I would say I was raised in a very traditional style of masculinity, boys not crying, keeping in feelings. And through life experiences and my work in higher education, I have found other ways to express masculinity, and would like to help encourage others to express themselves in more healthier ways, because I don't think the way that I was raised was the most healthiest for me. And so when I think about how some men have responded to some of the current situations we find ourselves with, the COVID-19 pandemic, the presidential election, and the Black Lives Matter movement, I think they're becoming a little bit more comfortable being uncomfortable and speaking about some challenges or things that they have dealt with, and seeking help, particularly around mental health issues, which I think is very important. And for me, in the African American or Black community, that's not a big thing. And so I think the courage to begin to try to break those stereotypes is huge.
Thanks, Benny. Appreciate that. And we're certainly going to come back to that. And if there are folks on the panel who have questions for you, we'll begin that dialogue shortly. But the piece around mental health maybe would be a nice lead in. Dr. Neal, I'd love to invite you to step in, please, and answer the same question.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. It's great to be a part of this esteemed panel, and thank you, Taj and Tom, for this invitation. So what I bring to this panel is my socialization as a white male in our white supremacist and patriarchal society. It's taken me a number of years to recognize how my dominant identities could be best used for social change. I landed in clinical psychology after dabbling in K through 12 education, consulting, social work. It's really a good fit for me to be sitting either across the room from someone or even in a group. But that therapeutic component has really been a powerful experience for me as a clinician. Through that experience and training as a psychologist, I've learned to understand how the psychosocial costs of white male privilege bear down on anyone who does not identify as cisgender male or white. But I also see how those same systems affect white males. And the salient emotion that I see here, December 2020, is anger. In my field, anger is often seen as a secondary emotion of other kind of softer emotions like vulnerability, guilt, shame. So whether we're talking Proud Boys or Black Lives Matter supporters, there's an immense amount of hurt that has been displaced as anger. So besides that individual psychopathology and subjective family experience, racism and sexism are definitely at the heart of some of that emotionality.
You know, it's an interesting connection I just heard you making between, and I'm not hearing you making a parallel at all between Proud Boys and Black Lives Matter. Right. I clearly that's not at all what you're saying, and that's not what I'm saying. But to talk about how the pain and the hurt, whatever that is there, and how it may manifest very differently. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Brooks, I'd love to hear you weigh in.
All right. So first, thank you so much for inviting me. It's so great to be here. My name is Dr. Darrell Brooks. I hail from Baltimore, and I just want to acknowledge the land on which I sort of occupy in Baltimore as the Piscataway Nation, as well as the Lumbee people, and wanted to recognize that as we sit in this context, this social political context, where racism and the intensity of it has drawn so much attention that it becomes important for us to name all of the ways in which systems of oppression have tried to strip and take away and to marginalize and even erase whole populations of people. And just want to acknowledge that. And so I enter this work as a Black queer researcher and scholar, and someone who believes in examining the ways in which unexamined notions around sort of gender and masculinity actually positions queer folks, but Black queer, particularly in my research, Black gay and bisexual men in particularly dangerous relationships. Partly because the idea that Black gay and bisexual men can't experience intimate partner violence, which my work looks at, and that when it's unexamined, what happens is that the violence becomes normalized. Healthy relationships become hard and difficult, and the lack of structural resources and supports actually makes it harder to do what Benjamin was saying, which was around how do you begin to deal with the underlying emotionality of existing with guilt and shame and anger and frustration, and how do you use it in ways that does not do harm to other people. And so I enter just with that particularly race and sexual orientation, gender identity at the forefront of my work. And just to name that, I think Black queer men have shown up very and continues to show up in our social justice spaces, particularly in the Black Lives Matter movement, and wanting to make sure that that recognition of their enduring persistence sometimes even comes at the cost of their own safety because of the ways we don't examine heteronormativity and the toxic masculinity, if you will, that sometimes is associated with these big rallies when you have millions of people and you don't know the politics of all of them.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really critical piece about who is considered to be, who's visible, who's not visible, who's made invisible. So thank you for that. All right, let me, and we'll come back to that. Thank you. And Noah.
Good evening. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, just following suit off Dr. Brooks, and I appreciate that support challenge opportunity to acknowledge the land that I occupy in my white body at this time, which is Duwamish land. So acknowledging that as I come from Seattle, Washington, it's the land that was occupied by the Duwamish people. Just love coming in on the harmony and chords of this conversation so far. It feels good to be in conscious light with other men, coming across our differences, examining the ways some of equity or inequity show up in us. Really appreciated too, Ben and Benny, bringing in that idea of trauma, looking at maybe the Proud Boys and thinking of some of the theory I've been introduced to recently from Resma Menakem and my grandmother's hands. Maybe the Proud Boys have that dirty trauma. They haven't processed their own trauma. And so they blow that oppression and pain through their white identities, through bodies of color, through brothers and sisters and others in our LGBT plus community, through women and so on. I also think of this opportunity that COVID has provided that allows me to do some positive or healthy healing. I've been able to interrupt some of my cycles, my own behaviors that I usually turn a blind eye to when I'm participating in the rat race. And so it's allowed me to come better in my relationships with others and make sure that I'm practicing equity. That's what I'm noticing at this time.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. I also want to appreciate the acknowledgement around the stolen land that we're on, and so acknowledge that Fallacies is on in Western Massachusetts, which is Nipmuc, Pecumtuck, and Wabanaki Confederacy stolen land. So thank you for that. I do want to continue to have this conversation, and I don't know if we need to have, and we could have all of the panelists with their on the screen so that we can actually talk with each other. Might be an interesting approach, is what I'm thinking. So I'd ask you to maybe to turn your cameras on, so we can see all your beautiful faces. Thank you, and I also want to highlight, what Dr. Brooks had said about queer men of color showing up in social justice spaces. Because really, the next question I really have is, because we've seen a lot of increase in people, local organizers, and we often don't know who those folks are, as you pointed out, athletes, politicians, and others who are speaking out about racial and other inequities and injustices. And what we see and hear and understand is that a lot of these efforts are being led by women, often who are queer and or women of color, and also knowing that there are men who are from what we would have been called marginalized communities, also are stepping in and taking leadership in a variety of ways, no doubt. And so with that said, I'm also curious about what you all see in terms of men's roles. Again, knowing that men is certainly not a monolithic category, right? But what do you see as men's roles in regard to leadership in social justice efforts and social justice movements? And I'll throw that out to anybody who wants to answer it. And of course, you all can ask each other as well.
Speaking from one of my group identities, I guess speaking, or a couple of them, as a white cisgender male, I find that part of my roles is often figuring out how to slow down. It's not always easy for me to do that, and I know when I'm not slowing down, I'm not able to practice some of the partnership skills that will allow me to show up as an accomplice towards equity, and that I'm usually overriding towards my adrenaline or discomfort, trying to find a quick solution or a way out. So slowing down is part of it when I'm speaking to my group identity. And then on my personal side, it's been a lot of recognizing that sometimes some of the work I've done around recognizing intersectionality. I appreciate what Dr. Brooks said, because some of the ways that I've worked with particularly white men around undoing white supremacy or structural racism, I don't realize that some of my behaviors show up differently when I'm partnering, for instance, with white women, because I'm also partnering across gender, or if I'm partnering with LGBT folks that I'm partnering across sexual orientation difference. So really looking at that personal level on myself and making sure I'm doing the deep listening.
So slowing down, meaning just kind of really stepping back as well?
No, not per se, but like not jumping into immediate action, not jumping into immediately tying the truth to the first emotion that I feel in a situation, but breathing, remembering to sink into that listening instead of sometimes clarifying my own intention, even to let some ambiguity exist. You know, sometimes having to sit for a while with some uncomfortable feelings, which still is, and not try to medicate that, not over, through substance or other things that can help me conceal those feelings.
Yeah. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Other folks
Yeah.
want?
Yeah, if I may, I'd love to jump on some of what Noah just shared. I guess given my privileged identity group memberships, I've always kind of looked to how I can be most effective, and someone who has a master's degree in social justice education and was a women's studies major in undergrad and has tried to do his due diligence when it comes to cultural competency. I wanted to work with people that look like me, and, sometimes, like Noah says, I got to slow down if I'm in a room full of 80 fraternity members on a Sunday night meeting, trying to kind of bring them along when it comes to sexual health or what consent means, or working with athletes or people in the military or former military, surrendering to the time that it takes to do that important work with them. I also think now that I am a father, the role that fathers play in building social justice movements at home through their parenting, fathers modeling, sharing and participating in domestic life, having my son especially see me doing things that most men aren't doing, okay? Showing up as a model through appropriate language and empathy, conflict resolution, positive discipline. I think a lot of our movements can be built in the kitchen, can be built at bath time, can be built in the domestic sphere.
I love that.
I'm thinking about that piece you're talking about. I'm thinking about, I spent years in higher education also, and thinking about the number of times I met with fraternities and talking about consent and having the same question being asked over and over and over. And I started thinking to myself, and the piece I said to myself was, I've been doing this work for years. How come you don't get it? And then realizing I got to step back and go, okay, because they don't get it because they're 20 years old and haven't thought about it yet, and nobody, and maybe their parents and their fathers or their mothers or whoever was that was raising them, hadn't modeled that, or the people that they went to school with wasn't being modeled. So.
Yeah, if I could jump in, one of the things that I've been paying close attention to, and it ties to sort of what you were naming, Tom, in terms of sometimes folks who are identifying as men, cis men specifically, entering into this work. I was having dinner with one of my friends. She's a white woman, and she was moving away. And so we were saying goodbye. And so one of the things that came up was that in her spaces where she does her work, there are often men, specifically white men, who typically kind of erase her experience or talk over all of those things that we are very familiar with and understanding the dynamics of sexism and how they play out. But we got a little bit deeper because I was just, I was on my second glass of wine and just trying to let my mind just wander. And I said, well, actually, her rationale was that they don't really know what they're doing. They really don't know. And I said, I don't believe that. What I believe is that when we've grown up, particularly as men, cis men, we, all of our bad behavior is just miscoded as being boys being boys. So we don't ever attach a negative or a corrective lens to the work because we don't talk about it in terms of actually doing harm to people. In reality, what's being done is actually harm. And so you keep asking these questions of me working also with college athletes and talking about consent over and over and over again. But when I begin to go back and do the history of it and just kind of listen to their own stories, I could see the failures of our own community members, particularly men growing up, where they were not saying, not only just was it the difference of consent and what consent means at the time in which they were coming up, but the fact that we don't even allow a label, even one that would sort of help people be corrective, to be attached to manhood. And so we just get away with so much. And so I don't believe this narrative that somehow men just don't know. It's just that the fact that we failed them by never coding their inappropriate and unhealthy behaviors as such up until they're in 22 years old in college. And I think for her, that was a hard pill to swallow, because it's easy for she needed to hear that they just didn't understand. And I know from my own socialization, even though I'm queer, that no matter what I did, I could get away with it because I was a boy just being a boy. And it was never anything about a bad behavior. It was just he's roughhousing or anything like that. So I feel like we need to really interrogate that as well, because it's deep seated in terms of how we get to this place of keep questioning and wondering over and over and over again. But it's actually, as you know, a systematic failure that gets us here.
Yeah, to me, what you're saying fits in with the idea. It's that we're not exploring what patriarchy is, right? We're given permission by patriarchy, because I think you're right. I think that most of the men I've worked with over the years, they know what's right and what's wrong and what's okay and what's not okay, and they know when they've crossed a line around consent. I actually believe that. And in all the conversations I've had, I think when I say, how come you're not getting this? Because I've been doing this for this long, I also know that they are getting it, and they do get it on a different level. What they're also getting is a permission to not pay attention to those cues, right? Because that's part of what patriarchy's telling us and giving us. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It's how do we explore the systemic messages and dynamics that play into individual behavior, individual interaction.
Mm.
I think, yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Benny, does any of that play out on a college campus at all?
Not at all, Tom. Most definitely, there's a lot, I think, that goes into it when we think about what happens on a college campus. How I think we are being very mindful of intersectionality, and the way that we are portraying and engaging our students, I think, is very important. And I think we have to be very intentional about our engagement to make sure that we are collaborating. And one of the things that I try to do in my work is to make sure that all voices are at the table, or all voices are being included in the conversation, so that we can get all the different perspectives necessary to address the different concerns or different challenges or different tactics that are coming up. My experience as a Black cisgendered heterosexual man is different than a Black cisgendered homosexual, or even someone who identifies the same but lived in a different neighborhood, right? We have different experiences, we have different expectations. And so how are we making sure that all of the needs are being met? So I'm really big on that collaboration. And I think as we think about future and social justice movements, I think that collaboration piece is going to be huge, because, as we have seen, our country is just made up of so many different types of individuals. And it is very important that we pay attention to those differences so that we can be mindful of how to effectively interact and engage with them. And particularly on a college campus, particularly when trying to make students feel at home or feel welcomed on that campus, it's very big that we collaborate and make sure that voices are being heard, especially those that are on the margins.
Benny, is your campus mostly virtual right now, or a lot of
right now? Yeah, so right now our students are on break. We finished finals, I think, of Wednesday last week. However, this fall semester we were multimodal, so we had in-person classes, virtual classes. We went completely remote after the Thanksgiving break, and our hopes is to have a similar experience in the spring semester. So students can opt to be completely online if that works for them in their circumstances. But students do have the options to be on campus, and there are some in-person classes.
I'm asking because I'm wondering, and for all of you really, I'm wondering, we're here talking about the impact of COVID as part of this, and how if you see this playing out differently in your different spheres in a virtual context versus an in-person context, or how that plays out differently.
I think it's completely different for me, particularly on a college campus. I mean, for me in particular, I'm new to the institution, and so trying to get a sense of how the institution operates and understanding what the students need is difficult when there's not as many students on campus, and the campus is not as active as it would usually be. And I think everything, or most of the things that our students are engaging with, has a virtual component. And so I'm sure we've all heard of that Zoom fatigue, right? And so students are just trying to engage them, even in something fun and interactive, virtually is a challenge, because they're like, I'm done with Zoom, I'm over it. And you add on the different challenges that the pandemic has made. Maybe there's some family challenges, maybe they've been sick, or other situations all onto that, and it just really plays out differently particularly for students, and I'm sure it has impacted many others in a variety of ways. So it definitely changes the dynamic, especially in the engagement of these important topics.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm thinking, listen to Benny's last sentence around the impact of COVID and then this virtual reality we're showing up in. In some ways, it's been both. Yeah, definitely a curse. I love engaging with people. I believe in the alchemy of what happens when human bodies and energies and minds come together and share space and co-create together. I really do believe in that. And I've personally loved, for instance, not being on the road, as I've told you, Tom, 2.5, 3 weeks a month. So I'm present with my daughter. I'm present with my wife. It's a different role. I love what others were saying, like Ben was saying, or like modeling, dismantling the patriarchy, or about, undoing white supremacy, one bath or one potty lesson or one meal cooked at a time. Like and having the ability to be bored with my daughter and process those emotions, and not just show up and be like, we're kicking it on the weekend. I got my paycheck and we're going to kick it till I dip out of town again. So I do really like that. And then, of course, not of course, but interestingly enough, by working in the corporate sphere, it's almost a little different than some of what I'd say, Benny, I'm hearing from you. A lot of times I'm working with white men we're unpacking our privilege in our conversations together. And there's almost like a hunger for this conversation. It's like there's starting to be this reckoning that's going on in some ways, is what I'm noticing. And the power to lean in and see privilege not as like, oh, that means I have to remove myself from the conversation and only feel guilt, but I need to lean in deeper, experience discomfort, and begin to, as my friend Tom Schiff would say, use that privilege strategically to forward equity. And I am noticing more of a space for that with this technology right now. Curious what is going on for Dr. Brooks or Ben.
Yeah, so I think for me, I think of COVID partly in the context of the realm of intimate partner violence. And so the fact that we are now in a virtual environment, the majority of our schools, our students are out in their homes. We've also seen the uptick of intimate partner violence, or domestic violence, if you will, and has that gone up? And then there's less time for folks who experience intimate partner violence to get out, to have a reprieve, and get the resources that they need. And so when I think about sort of what this space has allowed for, I was just talking with some sexual assault practitioners, and it created new pathways to get to people, because you don't have to travel as long, but that also means that it could be also difficult at that same time to actually, for that person who needs those resources, to find a safe, quiet place in the home that they're in order to do that. And so I feel this moment has created, I think, many new opportunities but it also has forced, unfortunately, many families to report increased rates of intimate partner violence. As I think about not only COVID and discrimination, structural racism, the fact that it leads to so many unemployed families and all of that cumulative stress, we know also as can lead to substance use and drinking and all of those things that increase the likelihood of intimate partner violence. And the problem with that I see in my queer work, of my queer lens, is that we don't have much information on the impact of intimate partner violence in queer relationships. And that's what I'm trying to change in doing my work to get at those particular pieces.
And while there's already a dearth of resources in general, right? I mean, there's a dearth of resources in general, and then when you layer in, so we're talking about men who are men of color, who are queer. I mean, the resources just continue to go down and down and down and down, right? And so then it's interesting because the other day, so Noah and I we do work together, and we were working with a group of corporate leaders, which I won't name any names because we shouldn't talk about that. And one of them was saying something about, with the pandemic and everything being virtual, they're seeing into people's homes a little bit more, into people's lives, and it's giving them a better sense of, oh, this person has to take their kid to school or set them up on a computer, or this person has to do this. And it makes me think, though, with what you were just saying, Jarrell, around, and so how much of those folks are also having to balance everything to curate the image of what it looks like on the screen, right? To make it seem like everything is hunky-dory, because if I don't, I'm in serious danger. I'm in serious danger anyhow, but it amps it up a little bit more. Yeah.
Yeah, Tom, I think the illusion and the as you were talking about the need to have that facade is really significant. And as in my role as also the policy chair, working with our school district, some of the similar challenges are showing up. So literally, people are seeing into homes, and what does that really mean for families who are already struggling, living in concentrated poverty, and then what's teachers' roles in trying to have to report things that they see, and also, I live in an urban area, so there's things that kind of emerge that would require mandatory reporting, and all of that becomes even more tricky and complicated now because you're literally in someone's home in ways that you were never before. So it's created some unique dynamics even at the school district level.
Yeah.
Briefly, yeah, I can definitely corroborate Dr. Brooks's assessment of marital and family discord is significantly up and causing lots of myriad stresses and hardships. Some of the most interesting interactions I've had are with folks who hold quite a bit of privilege across a number of social identity group memberships, and they feel oppressed having to wear a mask. They feel oppressed having to abide and obey the varying dials of restrictions we have in our community. This is really pissing them off, and it's unleashing all kinds of other stuff that's just leaking out. And I'm just picking up the pieces, noting this, noting that, coming back around. But it's anger, but it goes back to this well, I think, of grief that they've had for whatever subjective or objective experiences. It's just going back to that same well of grief. And it's almost like a hurricane over water, just gaining momentum and gaining energy. And it's been intense. It's been intense as a clinician. And I don't have the access to body language and other forms of interactions that I'd have in person. And so it's at least in my field, it's a bit hampered, but there's some upsides to it as well, in terms of keeping everyone safe and stable. So I don't know, that's my 2 cents from the couch in the therapy room.
From Colorado Springs.
There you go.
And what you're saying around, so this is also related to how COVID is having different folks take different kinds of health risks. Because, you know, it's like we know that men as a large category don't access health services, take more risks with our health, those sorts of things. You know, that, I mean, there's like a lot, again, different layers, depends on what group of men we may be talking about, and also have different access to resources as well. And so it's way different access to resources. And so to think about how COVID then relates to like what I hear you talk about, Ben, you know, it's really like I'm angry and I don't care and I'm going to take a risk with mine, but somebody else's health as well.
Yeah.
So I don't think we're getting a whole lot of questions here, so I'm going to just keep asking them because I think you kind of answered one that I saw. So I'm going to move on because I really want to ask this question. It's a long one, but I'm going to ask it because I got to give a little bit of introduction. So Dr. Brooks, in 2017, you published an article entitled Reconceptualizing Love, Moving Towards a Critical Theory of Love in Education for Social Justice. Just love I love the title, and I thought the article was brilliant. No surprises there. I should mention, I should necessarily mention this, but when AOC becomes president, I'm suspecting that Darrell is going to be the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Just putting it out there. Okay, if that's what
I'll take that, Tom. I will take that.
Okay, I was hoping you were going to say that. All right. So anyhow, so in the article you state the work of love, or rather a critical theory of love, and I'm making sure I read this directly here, both understands the innate dignity of all human life and also actively creates practices that reunites and rehumanizes. It is the kind of love that allows oneself and another to resist erasure and dehumanization in the context of systemic injustice and oppression. Beautiful. And you also quote Dr. Cornel West, who said, "Love is what justice looks like in public." Love is what justice looks like in public. So I would love to hear first from you, Darrell, Dr. Brooks, excuse me. I'd love to hear from you your views on how love fits into this conversation that we're having. How does love fit into this conversation that we're having? And then open it up to everybody like we've been doing. So what role does love play in engaging men and their expressions of masculinity? What does it look like in neighborhood settings? What does it look like in school settings? What does it look like in all of your contexts? What does that look like? And how do you navigate this process with folks?
Yeah, so you know, I won't go into all of the backstory behind that article, but you know, I think sort of when I talk about a critical theory of love, and I use Brooks Hill's notion of critical, which is to challenge and unmask power. And so when I'm talking about love or critical theory of love, I'm talking about the ways in which through our interpersonal interconnections, I become aware of the ways in which power is either distorted or manipulated or transformed to sort of minimize and marginalize the experiences of others. And so when I take into account my sort of various social identity or group categories, then I get to center in the ways in which patriarchy, for example, is a form of power that sort of manipulates and abuses. And so the role in that space, and particularly for men, cisgender men in this context, is to interrupt every single opportunity for the erasure and the minimization of not only cisgender women, but also genderqueer and femme-identified folks. And so my idea of love is one that not only then requires us to grapple with the sort of power imbalances and try to rectify them, but it also says that there are a corresponding set of practices that require us to think about the ways in which we rectify and heal. And then so that then helping folks identify what those behavioral practices are so that we can begin to nourish folks into what I talk about as unapologetic wholeness and completeness. And so that, for me, when I think about social justice, when I think about this movement for Black Lives Matter, when I think about why folks march in the streets, particularly to demand or I think about the Me Too movement. I think about all of the ways in which people began to put their lives on the line, their livelihood, so that other people could have a better access and to live into the vision of themselves that they deem appropriate and want to live in. And so, so for me, any other kind of love is not that helpful if it's not really trying to rectify the abuses of power that we see every single day, whether it's around race and racism, gender, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, et cetera, ableism, classism. If you're not touching those things and not trying to address those and make people's lives easier and fully whole, I'm not interested in much of anything else.
Thank you. Love to hear other folks weigh in as well, please, if you want.
Well, for me,
Hard act to follow.
Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Brooks, for one, the article, which I hope to be able to read, but for your comments. But for me, on a personal level, I identify as Christian. And so love is the center of everything, right? Love is why I do the work that I do. I got into education, specifically in student affairs, knowing that I wasn't going to make a lot of money, right? I wasn't going to have a lot of downtime. It was because of the love I had for the work and for the opportunities that it presents to individuals. And I'm grateful to have had several opportunities to engage individuals in work that I think will provide them with the opportunity to engage in our local and national communities and even global communities, right, in an effective way. And as a Christian, the Bible kind of leads a lot of what I do. And the scripture in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 8, that chapter, 1 Corinthians, talks a lot about love, but verse 8 starts by saying love never fails. And so if we put love in the center of what we do, particularly in this work around masculinity, around race, around racism, and given the context that we're in a pandemic due to the COVID-19 virus, but also a pandemic around structural and institutional racism and racial injustice, right? If we put love in the center of that, I think all of the other things will fall into place, right? If that guides the work that we do, we will be able to effectively engage the necessary individuals, the important people in the right process. And it's not going to happen in a day. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's a continual process. And the love that we have for the work will guide us and push us to keep doing it, even though it can often be challenging. It can often be taxing, right? But it will continue to push us to do the work that we do and to make the change that we want to see happen.
Yeah, I love what both Dr. Brooks and I'm sorry, is it Dr. Williams as well?
No, we're not there yet.
Okay. I think it is Dr. Ben. I'm putting this all together right now. Okay. I went to I got my undergraduate at Evergreen State College Tacoma campus, which was actually many people know the Olympia campus. The Tacoma campus was founded by Dr. Maxine Mims in the 70s when she wanted to bring a liberation education model to the historical Black community in Tacoma and set up that college campus there. But there's a writing on the wall with a Sankofa bird when you walk in the building, and it says, "Enter to learn, depart to serve." And I think of love as well as entering into life with a stance of openness to learning. And by the time I depart this physical embodiment of life, I hope the legacy I'm judged by is my impact of service. So that's kind of maybe more of maybe how I think of it in a mindset, if that helps.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Just in terms of my situation, I think to be an effective healer, psychotherapist, I got to convey love to my male patients because it's integral to change. On almost a weekly basis, I'm confronted with the negative effects of hegemonic masculinity and white supremacy in the therapy room. And I got to meet those folks where they're at. I have to. It's taken me a while to get to where I am, and it hasn't been an easy road. I remember stumbling, bumbling, and really trying to pick myself up when I was really down in the dumps in terms of my white identity development. If we look to Helms, I was there in the guilt-stricken phases way back until I finally, at some point, I get to dip my toe into that autonomous stage where then I can feel liberated. And then but it took me some time to kind of have that love for myself, which then if I can do that, I can meet those other guys with whatever they're talking or whatever they're spewing. I can see through that and empathize. I don't get automatically defensive and I don't get triggered. And it allows me to, again, surrender and be at peace with them, to heal them and to bring them towards liberation within our circumstances.
So I heard, and correct me if you all had different ways that you heard this, but I kind of heard in some ways what I was hearing from folks is that love being both kind of a systemic approach as well as an individual approach, right? And I'm thinking, so on the latter part of that, how do we have love for the Proud Boys or a Proud Boy, right? I mean, and I'm not necessarily asking for you to have that answer, unless you do, because then that'd be great. But I've certainly heard folks who are former white, formerly in white supremacist groups talking about that is the way to heal folks is through love. It's not about telling them they're wrong and bad and so forth, but it's about welcoming them sort of back in a sense.
Yeah, I will just briefly say a note. One of the things that when I was doing my dissertation on love that became really, really clear to me was that people often did not have a good or hearty concept or construct of what love actually is. And so I actually had to use Dr. King's notion of love and to combine it with many different other forms to get to a type of love that would actually write and rewrite our history in ways that would move us toward equity. And so a part of that is also about accountability. And so for me, when I think about love, if there is no accountability, there can be none. And so so if I'm trying to have a conversation with someone who has a different way of thinking than me, I can fully respect and honor that perspective. And at the same time, I get to, again, like I mentioned earlier, challenge and unmask the ways in which power is being used and manipulated in order to create a system of oppression. And so my loving moment is that dialogical moment where we get to be in real community around sort of unpacking and unmasking. And you get to choose not to be a part of it. But at the end of the day, without that moment, without that sort of accountability structure built into the concept of love itself, we're gonna, our love is, as Dr. King would say, would be anemic. It would not allow us to do anything or shift anything substantively, not either at the interpersonal level or at the larger structural level.
Yep. Thank you. So we're getting towards the end here. I do want to turn to one question that has come from folks who are participants here. And if we can do this in a few minutes, that'd be great. So the question is, so what do you all recommend for female identifying folks to have in their toolkits for fighting misogynistic behavior? That is, like, if a man of power talks over you, or if a date is pressuring you sexually, what are some immediate sort of safe responses a woman can say to shut down behavior? I think part of this to me is what are some ways of more effectively challenging young men, older men's social power and upbringing? I think that's kind of at the root of that question, but I could be wrong. In a minute or two, we can answer that question. And not that I know that's a deep question, and I really appreciate that question.
It is.
Thank you for the person who asked that.
Like Benny was going to lean in.
Well, I'll just say a couple of quick things. I think courage is helpful, right? And having the courage to say something in that moment, if you can, I think it is definitely positive and necessary. You know, some of the kind of traditional strategies and kind of conflict resolution, using I statements, giving specific examples of what was the issue, trying to be as non-confrontational as possible, knowing that when you try to challenge or correct someone, their immediate reaction is to be defensive, probably. But I think besides the courage to have something to say something in that moment, one, trying to find allies or other supporters to help you, to whether it's encouraging you in that moment or supporting you in that moment, or able to help with the conversation. But also knowing when it's just like, okay, right now that you're not going to get it, let me just back off the conversation. And I'm not saying get away from the conversation, but just knowing that maybe right now isn't the right time to have it. How can I have this conversation effectively, maybe in a different setting or at a different time?
And so partly knowing your limits, it sounds like it's part of what you're saying, and also knowing that I'm going to step away from this, and then I'm going to later go talk to you, Benny, or Darrell, or Ben, or Noah, and say, I need somebody here as an accomplice. I need somebody who can support me in this. What do I do? I mean, it depends on the situation, because some of that was also like there's nobody else there. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's just in 3 minutes, there's a lot of things to pick apart on that. And first off, let me confess that even like I like the other men here, I center my life around aspects of this, but I don't have a clean piece of advice that blanket fits that situation. And also other times sometimes there's intergenerational aspects, sometimes without overgeneralizing, even millennials and others might even put up with less. And it might not, like, yeah, it might be that you need a male accomplice, or it might be that you're like, you know what, I want to organize with other women in here and gender non-binary people and make a statement. So I don't even want to go old school and say you need a male accomplice, which is the old school advice. And I think there's a lot of merit to it. I just don't, there's a lot of different pieces to it these days. I think we're emerging into some new energies. And I think certainly to Benny's point, there's some old tactics that he just relayed that I also think still have a lot of wisdom to them.
Well, I will acknowledge that I'm old school, in a different generation. I appreciate, no, I'm being serious. I really appreciate, I always appreciate learning. Part of what keeps me doing work with young people is I love continuing to learn. Not that I'm saying you all are young people, because you're not really, but you know what I mean. But Terrell, you were gonna say something, so I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, one of the things that I would see, I mean, in that particular last part of that, which was around like, how do you begin to stop the shame spiral that is attached with that? And I can't speak to the context of being a woman, but I know as being a gay man or a queer man, in which case you have to begin to recognize that this is your individual action and the response is a systematic response. So it's actually not you. It is not, so the way that I stop my shame response is by recognizing that the way that I'm being treated is often not because I've done something that was inherently wrong or because I said something that was particularly problematic, but yet the system creating a context that doesn't see me as whole or my opinion as valid. And once I be able to sort of pull myself out of that and recognize that that's the context that I'm working, the way in which I experience shame feels different and it flows different. And it doesn't necessarily always go away because it doesn't make it right, but I'm no longer impacted at the same level. And to be able to take that personally, and then to also strategize around what's the best way, effective way to get what I need to say across, whether it's with some help or without some help. And just generally one thing or tool that I love to use is just, I tend to love the compassionate communication framework because it's just really helpful for me as someone who's like kind of like snappy. And that like you probably wouldn't hear me most of the time. So I try to like use a tool to like help orient my thinking to do that.
That's a good one.
Yeah, and I would say that the system is set up like you're saying. The system is set up to blame and shame, because that's part of what happens as it's supporting power. These systems are about supporting the current power, and therefore it's to minimize and deny the experiences of those not without power, but in lesser places of power that aren't like white cis men and other places of that, in those positions, and to deny and to blame and to shame and so forth as part of keeping those systems in place. So I think that's a really critical piece. And thank you for adding that part of the question, because you're right, I didn't read it all there. Not that you said that, but we have come to an hour, and so much too short of a conversation. I want to keep talking with you all, and we could, but we're not going to. But maybe we'll have a part 2 at some point. But I want to really thank you all for being here, for your brilliance, for the great work that you do in the world. I want to thank folks for showing up. And as we said at the beginning, this is being recorded, has been recorded. So we will post this on our website sometime, probably pretty soon. Doesn't take very long to do that. So again, thank you. But I will ask if any of you all want to have any like closing comments. Here we go. I see, that's the real power in that family, as I know. So any closing comments that you all, if you're willing to speak, take a couple of extra minutes, or we can close down.
Just as a panelist, I'm thankful to learn from Dr. Brooks, Benny, and Ben today. Really honored Tom and Taj for the invite. And personally, it's a step up in my equity game to be with B and Emilio. I've never had ASL, and I love the access that provides. So thank you for your intentionality in that.
Yeah, I also want to thank B and Emilio. You all did a great job. So I'll give you a hand here. Or I guess it's like this, really.
Yeah, I just want to also just say thank you. It's been a great pleasure to meet folks and to reconnect with old friends, and definitely appreciative of our interpreters as well. So thank you so much. And people can please feel free to reach out to me. My name is spelled uniquely. So if you put that spelling of Darrell in there, you'll only find me. So you can do that as well.
The one and only.
Yeah, I mean, the work continues in 2021. I mean, Trump has left a certain model of masculinity, and it's troublesome. And I think the work will definitely continue. If not, you know, we're going to be in a mess. And so I hope to bring up this next generation of folks, bring them, give them the mic, help them get that exposure they need.
All right.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was great to learn and to work with the panelists tonight. And I just hope folks stay engaged in the conversation because this is important work.
And I want to thank all of you for being here. Thank you for the folks who came to listen. If you want more information about fallacies, certainly you can get in touch with me. Our website is www.fallacies.org. And thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Right. Bye.